Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we return to Commander the Great War. I'm going to be returning to this series more regularly until I finish it up. The situation as it is right now is the Italian front is looking disastrous. The Allies have seemingly broken through and are driving into the heart of Austria with the southern flank of Germany at risk. The situation in the Middle East is just as disastrous, with the British having a full breakthrough along with the Arab rebels there, with a chance to break into, well, they've already gotten into Syria, but they're seriously threatening to get into Anatolia and drive into the underbelly of the Ottoman Empire. The positive that we have going for us at this point is that the Russians surrendered last turn. So just as historically was the case in late 1917, the Central Powers were able to overwhelm and force Russia into a less desirable peace. We didn't take as much Russian territory as I would like, but nonetheless we did manage to throw the Russians back, inflict serious casualties on them, and win the war there. The problem that we face right now is the fact that we simply don't have enough manpower to replace our losses, and okay. Well, good news. Italy has also asked for peace. Let's see here. So with that treaty, it looks like the Italian front is closed. You can see the yellow marks the Italian front, so it looks like we just need to retake Trieste, and the Italians don't gain any of that land. They basically have surrendered to us, so we get all the Italian land that we want, and the Italians get to keep what little bit of northern Italy that they had under their control. The Italian front was quickly spiraling out of control, but it looks like the occupation of Rome and the rest of Italy means that Italy will be happy to surrender with only northern Italy and the Sicilian islands left to their control, which I'm more than happy with because it cuts off that front as a potential avenue of advance for the Allies in the future. So that limits one front that we have to worry about. Now we can rush those troops back north to deal with the French front. So good news again, Italy has been beaten, the Russians have been beaten, and now we just have to worry about stabilizing our other fronts. Hopefully with these reductions of the fronts that we have to worry about, we can form some semblance of a defensive here, because you can see the French are pushing us back here on the French front. They have far superior armies in terms of manpower and equipment, far more troops on the front. That'll change soon, but they also have way more advanced weapons like aircraft and artillery than we do. So that's certainly something that we need to rectify here in the coming turns. But hopefully that will be rectified soon. So you can see here Italy surrendered. The Ottomans, the Germans, and the Romanians don't have sufficient industry to pay their upkeep, although we did just get some industry, but we got an industry bonus. Basically, Germany has a unique situation amongst the Central Powers in that they get transport ships, which represent foreign trade. So when those sneak through the blockade, it can actually help your industry, which is realistic when you consider that Germany had the second largest merchant marine when World War I broke out, and was heavily reliant on their massive shipping industry for bringing in resources from places like South America, the German colonies, which by now would all be conquered, but basically South America and other important neutral countries which had resources that Germany needed, like rubber, that would be more from Africa. That would be important for the German industry. But anyway, you can see here we are bringing some troops to bear, hopefully to stem the Allied tide. We launched some rather unsuccessful attacks, but we did manage to perhaps blunt the effectiveness of that French army on the south there, weakening it heavily. And now we can race some troops in by rail as well to plug the holes in our lines, racing troops from the eastern front to hopefully stabilize things. We may not have a ton of fully strengthed units. We don't have a ton of units that are like strength 10 or better. I'm trying to kind of pick and choose what I move by rail to get the best units into place as quickly as possible. But nonetheless, we do have reserves which we can bring in, and just plugging the hole, even if they're not the most effective troops, will be useful to some extent. And there you can see we had a very successful attack on a French army just north of Strasbourg, which has fallen to the British, where we dramatically weakened that French unit down to 1. That's a full army-size unit, so that was some successful attack work done there. Another thing you need to consider with the victory against the Russians is we have a limitation on how many troops we can move by rail. So that little train icon on the bottom left will tell you how many units you can move by rail in the current turn you're in, or how many moves you have left more accurately. So you can see that the Germans can move 2 more units by rail, the Ottomans 1, the Romanians 1, and the Austrians have used all their rail points up. So that's going to be key in moving troops from the western or from the eastern front to the west, because again, you want to make sure, since you can only move a few units per turn, you definitely want to make sure you're moving the most important or the strongest and most effective troops. You also have to be on rail lines to do that, so you can't just move anyone. They've got to be already on a rail line, which represents the infrastructure necessary to transport those troops. You can see there, no one is going to be going to war with us anytime soon, so that's good. It doesn't look like we have to worry about the Greeks or the Americans coming into the war, so that's a situation that perhaps, had it happened historically, maybe the Germans would have been able to fight the Allies on the Western Front to a standstill without the knowledge that America was soon committing its vast hordes of manpower to the war. In fact, the eventual American inclusion in World War I was a key influencer to the Germans doing what they did in 1918 in terms of their strategy. So let's go ahead and talk about that for a little bit. So as we've already said in previous videos, I think numerous times, in 1918 the Germans were coming off their victory against the Russians, and they were racing a massive amount of troops back from the Eastern Front to the west. The Germans still kept over 1 million troops in the Eastern Front to maintain the new territories that they had taken from the Russians, but nonetheless they were able to race a large number, over 1 million men, back from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and get them into the trench line in late 1917 into early 1918. Now the question for the Germans was what to do. There was serious social pressure coming from home. The German population's rations were slowly being lowered more and more each year. There wasn't a ton of unrest in 1915, but by 1916 there started to be riots and disruptions and strikes in German cities as a result of the worsening social conditions. So as things were getting worse, the German High Command basically had to make a decision on whether they should feed the German people or whether they should feed the army. Now, feeding the people would end up perhaps appeasing people back home, but feeding the army obviously was required in order to continue the conflict. So the Germans decided to feed the army to a larger degree, although the rations were still miserable there, and let the population's rations continue to decline. This meant that the Germans knew their window for victory was short. The German people wouldn't put up with poor rations forever. They wouldn't basically be able to just starve. And the other, perhaps more important aspect, in the short term anyway, was the arrival of the Americans into the war in 1917. America in 1917 was the most industrialized country in the world. Its economic output far outstripped every other country. Great Britain, when you take its empire, perhaps was superior or at least close, but in terms of the actual domestic United States, it was the most powerful economic country in the world. The Allies already had an advantage in terms of supplies because their supplies to their colonies were open, and that allowed them to a large degree to avoid the crippling social pressures that Germany was dealing with. The British were suffering to some extent because of the German U-boat campaign, but again, the introduction of the United States into World War I meant that the Germans felt they had a closing window. Most importantly, once the Americans became fully involved in the war, they'd be able to transfer massive amounts of troops to face the Germans, and the Germans were already facing the French, the British, and numerous other countries in the Western Front all by themselves. Germany by itself could not hope to hold out against a large part of the world. So the High Command made the decision. They were going to use the extra 1 million men not for any kind of defensive campaign, not to try and bleed the Allies dry or lengthen the war, but to try and end the war in one fell swoop. A massive offensive in the early part of 1918 was what was decided. The hope was that this victory could be accomplished before the Americans could bring sufficient numbers of troops to bear, and that while the American entry into the war was unfavorable, the war would be over before the American troops were able to really take part in the conflict. So it seemed that the Germans had a window. And in fact, in early 1918, the Germans actually had more troops in the front lines than the Western Allies did. The Germans outnumbered the Allies fairly sizably along the front line. And then you also had the fact that since the Germans were going to be on the offensive, they could decide where to launch the attack and maximize their advantage even further. Because while the Allies had to defend the entire front line, the Germans could withdraw their troops on the other lines, at least to kind of a skeleton force, to bring massive concentration of force to bear at the point of the attack, while again allowing their other forces to remain relatively weak in the knowledge that the Germans would have the initiative. So in early 1918, the Germans began prepping this massive offensive. The offensive would take place on the Western Front, kind of in the north-central part of the line where the French and British lines met. The theory was that the Germans could drive a wedge between the French and the British armies, pin one up against the sea and either bypass or destroy it, leaving them to deal with the other. The hope was to break the French and British, drive the British up against the sea, defeat the British, and then turn to deal with the French in turn. The Americans were not yet sizably involved yet. So that was the theory. Rolling back a little bit before we talk in detail about the actual offensive, which was called a codenamed Operation Michael, which was the first major effort in 1918 to overwhelm the Allies. The German army had changed to a large degree in the offensives of 1918. We had mentioned in previous videos that the Germans were experimenting with new tactics called Hutier tactics, the idea of the short, incredibly intensive artillery bombardment that was followed up by infantry assaults, infantry that were armed with wire cutters, grenade throwers, grenade launchers, flamethrowers, all sorts of new weapons that were coming into war. And by early 1918, the Germans even were starting to equip some of their soldiers with what would be the first sort of submachine gun. The Allies had some light machine guns which could be carried around and more mobile, but this was the first real kind of iteration of submachine guns. I believe it was called the MP-18. So these were some of the factors that the stormtroopers would carry. Rather than advancing in massed columns, they'd go forward in small units. They'd try to infiltrate through the lines, get behind the enemy lines, and isolate strong points and advance, continuously advance, letting follow-on troops mop up. So these were some of the new aspects that were coming into being as a result of all the years of failures on trench warfare. These had been slowly evolved and used in Italy to some success, used in Russia to some success, and now for the first time on a massive scale being used in truly massive forms. But the Germans also reorganized their military. They didn't have enough troops or enough manpower, enough non-commissioned officers for everyone to get stormtroopers. So what they did was they picked and chose what would be the best soldiers to get them into units that would have stormtroopers. So stormtroopers would be these elite small units, but they'd be based in larger divisions. And the Germans broke their army into two types of units, basically assault or mobile units or trench units. And the assault or the mobile units would get all the best equipment, all the best troops, all the best trained units. These were the divisions that would have stormtrooper units put within them, but the divisions themselves would have higher concentrations of artillery, better troops, better trained men. And what the Germans actually did was they took 40 divisions of their army. The Germans had about 205 divisions total, but they had about 40 divisions of their army were removed from the front line in the months leading up to March of 1918 when this massive offensive would take place. They took 40 divisions, they removed them from the front line, and they sent them into the rear areas in kind of occupied France or parts of Germany, where they would train for 4 weeks, intensive training, specifically for this offensive. So these were the cream of the crop. They removed any soldier over the age of 35 from these divisions and assigned them to other divisions. These were the youngest, these were the most extreme, the most talented, the most committed troops in the entire German army, concentrated into basically 1/5 of the German army on the Western Front, creating this iron fist, this premier striking force that was to bash its way through the front lines and destroy the Allies. And while this is a great tactic for giving yourself the best chance of success in an attack, it also means that you're lowering the quality of the troops in the rest of the army. The trench units would not be as motivated. They wouldn't have as high a morale. They'd have more dissenters in their ranks. They'd have more people who were less committed. And it also meant that as you launched your best and brightest into offensive action, if they were killed in disproportionate numbers, it would mean that the replacements that you would have for them would be of lower quality. So you're basically taking your best, your brightest, your most committed, the guys who are most likely to oppose any kind of mutiny, the most likely to keep ranks and keep morale up within the other units. You're removing them from the scene, and you're creating these strike troops. So you're creating two levels of soldiers, which really opened you up to great success, but also risked weakening you. Actually, it's interesting, the idea of these different levels of troops, because the Soviets actually had similar ideas during the Cold War. They had, A divisions, which were made up of all the best equipment, the best trained men, the full-timers. And they had the B divisions, which were made up of, maybe less well-equipped, more heavily based on kind of short-term concept soldiers, slightly second-tier equipment. And then they had C-tier divisions, which were basically all, people who had already been removed from the army. They served their conscript time. They were basically the reservists with the worst equipment and whatnot. And these A divisions would bash a hole in the Allied lines and the NATO lines if the war, between the West and the East ever came. And then the B divisions and the C division would kind of mop up. But if those A divisions were ever stopped, then it meant that you'd be basically forced to throwing these lower quality troops into a meat grinder to get slaughtered in the event of an actual war. So that's essentially what ended up happening on the Western Front in 1918. You had these elite troops. So the Germans took these 40 divisions and they concentrated them. And we already talked about the German advantage in terms of overall manpower on the Western Front, but they also had the ability to concentrate their forces and choose their point of attack. And as we mentioned, the Allies were going to be the target. Obviously, the French and British lines, where the lines met, were going to be the target, specifically the British. So the decision was made that near St. Quentin, I believe is how you pronounce it, which was right near where the French and the British lines met, the Germans were going to concentrate their forces. And they were able to concentrate an overwhelming force in this area. In fact, when the offensive began on March 21st, 1918, the first day of the Operation Michael, the Battle of St. Quentin, which would take place from the 21st until the 23rd of March, the Germans had concentrated over 60 divisions against some 30 British divisions, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. In some places, the British were outnumbered as much as 3 or 4 to 1. The Germans also brought forward massive amounts of artillery with the likes the world had never seen. The Germans had more than 1 gun for every 12 yards of front line, when compared with previous heavy offensives, which would have usually been 1 gun to every 60 yards. And the Germans launched a 4 to 5 hour artillery barrage to start the offensive. And again, this was part of their new tactic of massive concentrations of firepower. In fact, the Germans would fire over 3.5 million artillery shells in just 5 hours. That was more artillery than the British launched over an entire week during the lead-up to the offensive of the Somme. The British fired over 3 million artillery shells in the Battle of the Somme over 1 week. The Germans fired over 3.5 million in 5 hours. It was a phenomenal display of artillery power. Shrapnel was launched in order to cut off supply lines. The idea was fire canister up there. It would rain down on the enemy troops. It would kill them. It would also rain down on enemy supply and communications trenches, cutting the front lines off, hopefully preventing the British from being able to launch counterattacks where appropriate, because they wouldn't know what was going on along the front line. The British had actually moved forward 30% of their troops into the front line, and by some estimates, some 10,000 frontline troops in one division were all at the very front of the line, and only 50 would survive the attack or the artillery bombardments. I don't think all the artillery was that successful, because the Germans did run into some serious pockets of resistance, but in general, the massive artillery bombardment along the very front of the lines was devastating to the British. The Germans attacked, and throughout the March 31st, they ran into some resistance, but the stormtroopers broke deep into the British lines, and then for the rest of the day and much into the second and third day of the offensive, the British were pushed back. In many cases, the fighting was incredibly fierce. The Germans, to a large degree, knew this was their last chance of victory, and so they fought like the devils, but the British did as well. And so Fighting was incredibly intense. In many cases, there were reports of prisoners being shot. In many cases, there were reports of units fighting to the last man and not even allowing themselves to be taken prisoner. But in the end, after one day of fighting, the casualties were enormous. Despite this massive artillery bombardment and these extremely well-trained troops, the Germans lost about 40,000 casualties in the first day, the same amount as the British. Now, that's probably incredibly effective fighting by the Germans. Usually the men on the offensive lost much more than those on the defensive. It was usually the counterattacks where the defenders' casualties would even out. But nonetheless, over 40,000 casualties in the first day's fighting on both sides. When you compare that to the Somme, the British lost, 60,000 men in that absolute debacle on the first day. So this is an incredibly bloody first day. In which the British are pushed back, and their entire First Army, well, not the First Army, what was it, the Fifth Army, I think it was forced to retreat, but not without inflicting heavy casualties. And remember, these are casualties the Germans cannot afford to take. These are their best, their brightest, their most elite troops. You really can't afford to take these kind of casualties on the first day of the offensive that is supposed to win the war. But nonetheless, the Germans overrun the Allied positions by the 23rd of March, and what hadn't happened in the entire war all of a sudden happened. The Germans run through these lines, overrun these lines, and suddenly you're fighting in open terrain. Trenches are nowhere to be seen. And it looks, at least for the moment, like maybe the Germans have accomplished something that might lead to actual victory. Suddenly there aren't trench lines, there's just green field in front. The British retreating, the Germans pursuing, and suddenly things look very much like 1913 all over, not 1913, suddenly things look very much like 1914 all over again, with the massed German offensive, heavily outnumbered Allied forces, and in the end, the forced retreat after incredibly heavy casualties. The war in the West looks like the Germans have just broken through. The Germans actually even had some tanks in 1918, some heavily armored tanks. The Germans didn't have many of them, but they had some. They obtained local air superiority as well. And their artillery's massive concentration, over 3,500 guns, actually over 6,000 guns, and over 3,500 trench mortars as well, led to a massive German superiority in firepower. But I think where we're going to leave this video is we're going to leave the video at the end of March 23, when the Germans have broken through and have begun to push the British back, and the British are almost in full retreat. Divisions are beginning to become scattered. The Germans are beginning to see literal open front lines toward the, I don't know what you want to call it, toward the French countryside. But there were some warning signs. The Germans didn't have clear objectives for this offensive. They didn't have a clear end goal. The idea was break through and pursue success. We mentioned it one other time, but essentially the Germans' goal was just to keep attacking in places that you were having success, places you were running your head into a wall, don't take the casualties, just kind of bypass it and go around. And that seems smart when you have limited manpower. But not having a clear goal or a clear area that you want to take meant that the Germans were just going to keep attacking, keep pressing as long as they were successful. But that also meant they were going to keep losing men, and it was hard to quantify whether an attack was actually successful or not. So that's really where we're at, March 23rd, 1918, 2 days into the Grand German Offensive. And as you can see here, the situation in the Western Front for ourselves, as we've transferred troops to the West, has improved dramatically. You can see we're starting to press the French. We actually have superiority in manpower. We actually have some spare industry. More troop transports have come forward. The pacification of the Eastern Front, the retaking of the German cities, and the taking of some Russian cities has allowed us to begin to build a stable front line on the Western Front, which may also allow us to launch counterattacks. In addition to that, we're finally able to bring in some reinforcements to the Ottoman Empire. We probably won't be able to throw the British back, but maybe we can bring in some Austrian and German troops so we can at least hold the Allies along the border of modern-day Turkey. And again, the Italian front isn't an issue anymore, so we're down to a two-front war, the war in the Middle East and the war in the West. And, right now things look promising. So I'm quite pleased with the way that things are playing out in the game. And I'll also return to talking more about the offensives against the Allies from March 23rd, or from the Germans from March 23rd on, and Operation Michael, as well as the rest of the war. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I appreciate you tuning in, and I think I'm going to go ahead and cut the video off here at about 25 minutes. So thanks again, guys, for watching. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, please let me know. I hope you're encouraged by the turn of events here on the Western Front against the Allies. I still feel weak in points, and I definitely am still out-equipped, but we'll see what happens here. Anyway, guys, I appreciate you tuning in, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.